area, so uh, so it's nice to have my home libraries hosting me for a presentation like this. So I'll share my slideshow. Okay, so here's the logo for Borscht Beat, which is, as mentioned, my radio program, a weekly Jewish music radio program on WJFF Radio Catskill up in Jeffersonville, New York, though they're actually moving to Liberty, New York in a couple months. It's also my record label that I operate, and overall, just my Jewish music brand. So I'm going to, in this presentation, sort of give an overview of how I came into this, my personal, familial history of Jewish music and radio and record collecting, and I'll get into some of my favorite songs or records from my collection. So for now, I can't talk about any of this without talking about my grandfather, my Zaidi, Max Bendich, who was my biggest influence in this whole process of coming into my own in my taste in Jewish music and music in general, really. He's my primary inspiration here. He was born in New York City in 1915 to a couple of recent immigrants from Ukraine, and he grew up in the South Bronx, where he was exposed from his youngest years to diverse culture. On one hand, he had the Jewish ethnic folk culture of his parents and the rest of his family, but all around him were other vestiges of culture, both American culture and other immigrant cultures, popular culture, lower culture. The breadth of culture was all around him in the Bronx, New York. And in the upper left, we have a photograph of him at about 5 years old, a nice posed photograph where he and his whole family were all dressed up. He went to high school in the Bronx. He didn't attend college. He went off to fight in World War II and came back and operated a laundry business in the Bronx. And despite being not a particularly educated person and who led a pretty standard, unsuspecting, just simple life, he was a very self-educated person with a breadth of cultural knowledge, which I had the great pleasure of learning a lot from. So from humble beginnings. So I was born in 1994, which makes me 28 years old now. But the year I was born, the month I was born, my grandfather Max turned 79 years old. And but he was a very, very, very lively man from the age of 79 all the way up until the last years of his life. He was he had an incredible retention for all of that culture that he had been exposed to and cared so much about over his years. And he passed that on to me. So in the center, I have my father, my grandfather and I, and the bottom left, my grandfather, his wife, my bubby, Dorothy. And in the upper right, I have a wonderful photograph of my Zaidi at his 80th birthday party, holding the wonderful klezmer album, Rhythm and Jews by the Klezmatics. Now, the Klezmatics are the most successful and influential klezmer revival band, part of a movement of re-engagement in Jewish music that came about sometime between the late 70s into the mid 80s, though they were probably most prominent in the 90s. And I have a clip of a song, not by the Klezmatics, but rather the typical Jewish Yiddish folk song that my grandfather certainly sung to me many times, including from the very initial moments of my life, in that he would always sing Yiddish folk songs to his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, strangers, babies, etc. So here is that song.
Auf'm Pripetschak brennt a Feuer und in Stub is heiß. Und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinderlach dem Alef Beis. Und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinderlach dem Aleph Beis.
So that song, Eufen Pripyat, is the perhaps, well, it's one of the one of the best remembered Jewish songs, one of the best remembered songs of the Yiddish language. It was written in the 1800s, and it was a published recording, or composition, that is. It was not a folk song arising sort of naturally in some way from the people, but rather it was part of a performance canon, a published piece of music to be performed that was somehow absorbed into the folk canon. And this recording I shared is the wonderful singer Mark Ulf, who recorded 3 albums of Yiddish songs and 1 of Hebrew songs for Folkways back in the 1950s. And the lyrics of this song are sort of perfect for the way that my grandfather used it, in that it's about the old rabbi teaching the young child the alphabet in Hebrew, and the grim fact that hidden in the words, hidden in the individual letters, is so much sorrow. So it's a grim song, but it's also a beautiful one, and one that is loaded with an incredible amount of nostalgia for many people who have heard it. So my grandfather was a great record collector, and a collector of books and random knickknacks, McDonald's Happy Meal toys, you name it, he had many of them. But the walls were lined in some parts of his home in the Bronx with these record albums, which before the 1950s, commercial music was released primarily on these big, heavy plastic 78 RPM records that were 10 inches in diameter and sort of brittle. One side held but one song, and that they were bound up like books, and that's where we get this phrase record albums from. And as you can see, this photograph in the middle shows that his collection was largely operas, classical music, but every now and then there'd be something different in it, some Jewish music or American folk music. So that was all around me growing up. Then my father had his collection from his youth of rock music, and music that he had exposed me to as well in my younger years. And I just reached a point where I gained some independence. I started taking the Metro North up from Larchmont to New York City, and going to places like this record store that I've got the photograph of on the right, a place called Generation Records in Greenwich Village, New York City, and also places like Goodwill in the bottom left. When Goodwill opened in New Rochelle, I was all over it, buying records, but I hadn't developed a taste in these vintage records from 40, 50 years ago so much. I really was mostly calling my father and asking him what if this record or that record was any good. But over time, as I went into the city and to these thrift stores more and more, and developed some taste for myself from the internet or elsewhere, I began to amass a personal collection of records, stuff that covered rock music or even some of the American folk music that I'd been exposed to from my father and grandfather. And that continued through my high school years. And then I went off to Vassar College up in Poughkeepsie, New York. And my depth of interest in music inspired me to immediately pursue hosting a radio program. In the first week, they had a club fair, and I went straight to the radio club. I wanted to join, and I wanted to play music on the radio for some reason. It seemed like the right thing to do as a new college student. And I applied to host a show that was on the subject of folk music, American folk music through the last century. And I wanted to cover traditional folk music and contemporary folk music. Anyway, I applied for the show, and the staff of the station told me my pitch was much too broad. They did not give me a program. And then the next semester, I applied again with a really strong proposal that I was going to play the most absurd and off-kilter music that I could possibly find. And thus my radio career began with my program, which was called Don't Paint Your Teeth, a title that came from a song by an absurd musical artist who performs under the name of Jandek, somewhat anonymously. He refuses to share his real name with the public. So I've got examples of some of the music I was playing in that first era of my radio career. Stuff like Bob Trimble, Captain Beefheart with the absurd painting, Jad Fair and Daniel Johnston performing in their matching white t-shirts, performing some very absurd, simplistic or childlike music. And in the upper right, the wonderful BJ Snowden, who is a classically trained musician. She went for years of schooling in piano composition and records music that, and composes and records music that is regarded by some to be not typical enough to gain the regard as a sort of good music. And yet I was inspired by all of this. I thought it made good radio. And I even had the one opportunity to book BJ Snowden for a concert at Vassar College, which was a fantastic experience. And she's a wonderful, wonderful person. So to substantiate that some more, here is a clip of BJ Snowden performing her most notable song in Canada.
It is a home away from home. It's Canada, and Canada, and Canada. Folks treat you like a queen, and Canada, they never will be mean, and Canada, they treat you like a king. You feel welcome. It makes you wanna sing.
So that's BJ Snowden singing in Canada. And this was music that I thought I could really differentiate myself from the other people on air, build connections with the artists, and just learn a lot more about music and DJing. I became the station manager of my radio station, which made me a 24/7 on-call tech support guy, basically. It also got me into all of the meetings for the station staff. And
It is a home.
and I ended up taking on a second chunk of the radio schedule after noticing that there was an extra half hour that no one was using. So I was one of very few people who was on the radio for more than one day a week. And I decided that I would start playing music that my grandfather had shown me. But I was initially playing American folk music. He had exposed me to all of this that you see on screen: the wonderful Josh White, Elizabeth Cotton, Woody Guthrie, and Pete Seeger, all of whom were parts of this growth and interest in American folk music from the advent of commercially released physical audio media. That there was a increase in this interest, and record labels like Folkways, who I mentioned before for having released some Jewish music, were at the heart of this movement to share American folk stylings with the world. And I was using my knowledge of this to engage with my listeners in a different way, and to engage with the culture that my father had imparted to me as well in a different way. So here is perhaps the most notable song that Woody Guthrie ever composed or performed. A clip of it. It needs no introduction.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
So that was This Land Is Your Land, Woody Guthrie's anthemic classic tune about the American experience, the diversity of the American experience. And this song, among many others, was key repertoire for my weekly program of American folk music. So then by some interesting sequence of events, I began to learn Yiddish at Vassar through a very unusual and unconventional class that they were holding. And in learning the sort of rudiments of the language, I started to recognize words or phrases that I'd been exposed to from my grandfather, who was a native Yiddish speaker. It was his first language. And through songs that were in the textbook and other entry points, including cinema, because there was cinema produced in Yiddish, I found my way towards a sort of deeper cultural interest and obsession with this language and the associated culture. On the left, I have this incredible film, Mamele, starring Molly Picon, which is just a wonderful, dramatic story of an immigrant family where the daughter is denied her youth by virtue of having to raise her younger siblings as a surrogate mother. In the center, I have the essential collection of Yiddish song, Pearls of Yiddish Song, which was always around growing up, but I never could really understand until I started to learn the language. And on the right, the upper right is the Barry Sisters Sing, a classic Yiddish song LP, which features these sort of swinging jazz sort of renditions of classic Yiddish songs performed by these two women with exceptional voices. And in the bottom right, Mark Ulf, who played that rendition of the song I played earlier on in the presentation. Here is a clip of the Barry Sisters singing another classic Yiddish song, one that you might recognize if you've ever heard any Yiddish songs performed.
Tumbala, 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 laika, tumbala, 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 la. Spiel balalaika, tumbala, spiel balalaika, tumbala. Steht a Bucherin, Tracht, Tracht in Tracht, a ganze Nacht. Weimen zu nehmen, in it verschämen, weimen zu nehmen, in it verschämen.
So that song, Tumbala is an essential classic of the Yiddish performance canon, and all of the great Yiddish singers performed it. It's a riddle song where a young man and a young woman, one asks three cryptic questions and the other answers. It's a lovely one. So during the pandemic, I graduated from college. I had some distance from my radio experience, but I continued to collect records, Yiddish records, American folk records, records of my other sort of range of interests, but I did not have additional opportunities to share the music that I'd been exposed to growing up with the world, or even the other sort of unusual oddball music that I'd also become so accustomed to sharing on the radio. But during the pandemic, my radio station WVKR reached out to former staff and DJs requesting that if we were savvy enough to be able to assemble programming from our homes on our own personal computers, we can send it over and they would find a way to insert it into the on-air broadcast. And that's how I ended up launching my Yiddish radio program titled Laughing with Lizards, which comes from a Yiddish phrase that my grandfather often said when I was growing up, one that means to laugh with tears or to laugh with sadness. And so starting in somewhere around October 2020, November 2020, I was programming an hour of Jewish music on the radio each week. And then a couple months later, I'd gotten a hang of this weekly process and decided that perhaps another radio station would be interested in hosting the program. So I pitched it to WCFA, Cape May, New Jersey's radio station. And all of a sudden, I was a weekly syndicated radio show host, sharing Jewish music with two different communities. I got my grandfather to record the introduction to the program, and then at the end of each episode, I would record him singing a little snippet of one of these one of these Yiddish songs. And I was using this as a way to continue to connect with him, a way to keep him active during the pandemic. And it was a really wonderful, entertaining time. Plus, he was 105 years old at the time, so it was a nice thing for him. It was a nice thing for the public to hear a real old-timey voice of someone who really lived all of this incredible music and culture. So I'm going to transition into sharing clips of classic Yiddish songs, gems from my extensive Jewish music record collection, and sharing some key details about each tune. So the first one I'm going to share is one that my grandfather loved very, very much, Coney Island by the Barry Sisters. This tune was one that I would hear pretty much every time I would visit him, since he since in his 90s, he was given access to YouTube for the first time in his life. And through that, he was able to find all sorts of music that he didn't have on CD or on a record. And the most common video I'd say that he would watch was this video for this Barry Sisters song, Coney Island, one where people are just all on the beach in Coney Island. And it was just sort of ambient background imagery for the song. But my grandfather would point at the screen and say, look, see this? These people on the beach, that was us. So I'll play a clip of the song and then I'll talk a little about it.
War die Menschen, wo's hoben a tropical town. Sie gefindt sich a Platz beim tropical yam. Sie's gesinnt, die dich weiß, war Indian out. Wie die climate is heiß, in die Wasser is kalt. In Coney Island, in Coney Island, is a paar Genügen in Coney Island, in Coney Island. Ah, this is mein Land, so give sich a tropical down to the tropical seashore by them yum, 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 yum.
So that is the original version of this song that I was exposed to, the Barry Sisters rendition. What I didn't know until I started working on my radio program is that the Barry Sisters song, which was released in 1953 or 54, was in fact a cover of a song by a guy named Eli Bass. And the original song was called Coney Island, which is just like Coney Island, but written in a more dialect style of writing. Now, this version, the Barry Sisters song, has a sort of novelty instrumentation to it. But the original song, the Eli Bass version, is considerably more an ethnic parody, a calypso record. So they were trying, or Bass was trying to take this concept of calypso, of island music, and make a sort of joke that Coney Island in Brooklyn was your local tropical escape. And hearing the original version totally changed the way I heard the Barry Sisters version. I'll play it for you and I'll talk a little more about it. And you'll hear that it's very clearly ethnic parody, a calypso parody.
So here's a kind and you won't go wrong if you listen to this new calypso song. Van mensen was hebben naar tropical town. Zingen vindt zich op plaats bij een tropical jam. Weet zijn leven is billig, but the pleasure is grace. Weet de viber en de medelig en the climate is haze. In Coney Island, zes a paar genieken in Coney Island. Ah, that's my land. So give ze a tropical down to the tropical seashore by the yam, yam, yam. Zes a machaya. Hoodman. Hello, Mr. Goodman.
So the Barry Sisters cover of the original rendition of this song is a pretty faithful cover, but in some ways it plays down the calypso styling in favor of the Barry Sisters' signature jazzy pop vocal style. The lyrics are absolutely hysterical, with such gems as, you don't have to season the carrots and peas, there's garlic and cheese in the ocean breeze. So these songs are, the Eli Bass song is quite a rare recording, and it's not collected in any contemporary audio format. It was never on a CD, and there's no accessible digital version of the song. The Barry Sisters version is accessible on places like YouTube, which is where my grandfather heard it. But other than that, it was released on this original 78 RPM record back in the 50s, and then collected in this Hebrew National Kosher Classics record, as well as a obscure compilation album which featured the Barry Sisters. So this minor footnote in this wonderful discography of the Barry Sisters somehow became a recording of a lot of importance to me. Another gem from my collection is Jack Hilliard's fantastic record, Memories of My Father's House. I had encountered it, I don't remember the first time I found it, because the second time I found it, I was flipping through a dollar bin at some record store, and I saw the cover, and I thought, I've seen this before, but I can't remember where. And I accumulated it along with my other hundreds of records somewhere along the way. But this time I took the care to flip the record over and see on the back that it was featuring Mickey Katz's orchestra. Now, Mickey Katz was the quintessential Yiddish Jewish parody artist. He would take popular songs and popular stylings and turn them into klezmer-inflected parody songs. And this record, which apparently featured his orchestra, was not really well remembered as part of Mickey Katz's catalog. So of course I purchased my second copy of this record to bring it home and immediately listen to it. And what I heard was sort of popular American style renditions of classic Yiddish songs. And with this guy who has a very typical American pop vocal style of the time. But I couldn't find any information about him whatsoever on the internet. And digging, I eventually found his wife's obituary and was able to contact his two granddaughters who are named in the obituary and learned a great deal about this man's life. For one, he was a member of Mickey Katz's Borscht Beat, which was a stage review that featured a bunch of the great Yiddish performers of the time. And I found this Al Hirschfeld caricature of the Borscht Beat, featuring in the center, Mickey Katz, in the bottom right, the Barry Sisters, in the upper right, a wonderful singer named Rasha, and one of these folks on the left is Jack Hilliard. He never really took off as a solo performer, and he eventually retired or semi-retired to Miami, where he ran variety shows and had a very lively, social, and active final stretch of his life. But here I've got a clip of him singing a classic Yiddish tune, and you'll hear what his style sounds like. You'll hear what the record that I purchased was like.
Mein Glück hab dich gewinnen, wenn ich hab dich gewinnen. Scheinst die Täusen sehen, I hast mein Herz gekriegt.
So as you can hear, this rendition of Shein wie die Levona, a classic Yiddish song, is done in a very over-the-top and untraditional style. And which is also in its way incongruous to the record cover that we have here, which is this big headshot of Jack Hilliard, and then the title in big letters in Hebrew of all languages, whereas most of the music is not in Hebrew, but Yiddish. So it's overall a wonderful find, and one that I was able to learn a lot about through research that reached a sort of interpersonal level by meeting his granddaughters. Next, I have a personal, one of my personal favorite recordings that I've come across in my collecting history. I came across this song, Mein Städtele Jas, from this recording that I've got the album art for in the bottom right, More, Sing Along in Yiddish with Marv Kurz. And most of what I'll share is stuff that I learned later on after doing all of this research. So the song Mein Städtele Jas was composed for Max Kletter's 1939 operetta, Mein Städtele Jas. The first 2 minutes of the song is this brooding cry for for the shtetl, for the home that the character in the operetta has left behind. And he cries out, "Home, my beloved home, I'll never forget you." And then eventually there's this explosive, raucous, exciting outburst where he really, instead of melancholic longing, he expresses ecstatic longing. And this classic recording is so wonderful and energetic and artful, and also defies some of our basic expectations of what old music sounds like. It's a really exceptional piece. And what I found was that the recordings of this song that come after Kletter's original over time have less and less of that slow brooding buildup and more of the raucous outburst, to the point where this record from Marv Kurz, that must have been released some 30 or so years after the original Kletter recording, completely excises the brooding introduction and is all raucous, wild energy. I'll play for you a clip of the brooding, slow building intro from the original and a clip from the original explosive outcry.
My liebe Heim, oi wie wollt ich, heute noch einmal gewollt sein.
So that was the sort of characterizes those first 2 minutes of the song. Now here is the more lively portion of Kletter's original recording.
Ja, heißt es ja, gibt es doch kein öffentliches Leben, schrei ich so durch. Heißt es ja, so deine Küssen sind die schönste Welt.
So there's a little piano flourish and the excited orchestral backing. He doesn't sound so sad anymore, but his words are still imbued with the same incredible, intense longing. And now fast forward some decades and you've got Marv Kurz going totally wild on his recording. So recordings like this with wild vocal explosions are really what I'm in it for. I think that there's something so enthralling and just fantastic about listening to someone just going scat singing and seemingly losing their mind in performance in the studio like this. And it brings me a lot of joy and also helps me recall the feeling of longing that these immigrants felt when these songs were composed, and the longing that each performer imbued in their subsequent performances of these classic tunes. This record, Stan Snyder Sings in Jewish Circles, is one of the most important pieces of my collection. It's a very rare record. It's one that is pretty much impossible to research, and one that I'm very pleased and proud to own a copy of. One day I was in Brooklyn, New York, in Williamsburg, that is, flipping through the record bin at a junk shop. And I'd gone through an exceptional number of records, perhaps 1,000 of them. They have a lot at this store. And in what would have been the last possible row I could have looked in, I found this strange looking record. Stan Snyder Sings in Jewish Circles, with his face pasted in the middle or off center, and these concentric circles, the odd script, and the big Tikva Records logo in the upper right, which was, to me, a giveaway that this was an interesting piece, because I'm a collector of Tikva Records specifically. They were a prolific Jewish label based in the United States, but with releases coming from different parts of the world, different parts of Jewish experience. But this one I'd never heard of before. And the only information I could glean from it was this one box on the back cover, which says that he was the host of a radio program in Philadelphia called Kippers and Capers, the longest Jewish American radio program, which initially I thought meant longest running, but no, it was the longest program, running from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Sundays. So this guy was broadcasting Jewish music for 5 hours once a week at some point in the 60s, starting in 1963. The style of the music on here is kind of similar to that Jack Hilliard record. It's sort of pop renderings of these types of classic songs. And this guy's accent, his Yiddish accent, is so accented towards American English, perhaps a Philadelphia accent. It has to be heard to be believed. I'll play you a clip and share some more information afterwards.
Mein jüdische Mädel, sie ist so schön. Mein jüdische Mädel, mit der jüdischen Chein. Von goldener Herrlach, die Zehn noch wie Pferdelach, nur der jüdische Mädel kann sein so schön.
So, and there's something just so wonderful about that recording, hearing his accent, hearing the musical styling. It's just different. It's not what you expect when you're thinking about old-timey Yiddish language Jewish music. After thinking I was never going to learn anything about this guy, I decided I would just call every number that might be associated with him. I called like maybe 40, 50 random people and eventually reached his son, who told me that sometime in his father's early 20s, he was a radio host. He did it for some years and then just moved on to some technical career. But during that time, he paid for this record to be made by Tikva Records, by Alan B. Jacobs, who ran Tikva Records. And it was just incredible to make that connection with the son of this performer, this radio DJ. It makes me feel like there is a tradition of radio, of Jewish music on the radio that I'm just one small piece of. So here's another song, A Chazandal of Shabbos, which was later parodied as A Chazandal in America. The original tune is this incredible vocal demonstration. The lyrics of the song describe a cantor auditioning for 3 laborers in the shtetl. And for each laborer, he sings in a different way that evokes the labors of each person, or rather, they hear their labors embodied by the singing. And this song was sung by all of the great vocalists of Yiddish music. Each one took it as an opportunity to demonstrate their cantorial chops for religious music, but also just their incredible operatic voices more often than not. Later on, Aaron Lebedev, the great Yiddish theater performer, took the song and parodied it with a version that describes the cantor's audition to 3 restaurant owners, each from a different region of Eastern Europe where the Jews came from, and each with different foods that they liken the singing to. And not to mention, each has their own accent, which is just so over the top. A Litvish accent, a Galicianer accent, and an American Yiddish accent. So I will share with you a recording of the original song, A Chazandal of Shabbos, which came from none other than Al Jolson, who was perhaps the most popular singer of his time in the early 20th century. Before he was a popular singer, he was singing Jewish religious music, and among his first commercially recorded and released songs were some Jewish songs. So here is Al Jolson singing A Chazandal of Shabbos.
Azay vichti, mi di pedes veyatzi, mi di hamor la klappale, oter daven.
So that was Al Jolson. And here in the center is of the 45 RPM release of this song, which is not the original run. It was recorded some years before that. But yes, Al Jolson was a singer of Yiddish song. And on the left and right, I have the two vinyl records on which the original 78 RPM recording of the parody version of this song, it was released. And I'll play you a clip of this parody. Listen closely and you'll hear some of the ridiculousness. And I'm playing the last section where he sings of the American, in part because it's the funniest, but also because I'm assuming my listeners will understand the English or the Yinglish a little better than they'll understand the Yiddish.
My God! Gee whiz! Some Hasen! Hotel geprayed, sweet like sugar, like fine pudding, like ham and eggs, like chop suey with charmaine, like hot dog with mustard. Holy Moses, Jesus Christ, is so the Hasen! Hotel geprayed! That's all.
That's all. So in that final verse of the song, he lists off some American foods. And the foods he chooses to list are hot dogs and mustard, chop suey and chow mein, ham and eggs, of course. And then he proclaims, Holy Moses, Jesus Christ, is this a chazan? Is this a cantor? And of course, it's not kosher to consume ham and eggs. So this is something of an indictment of American Jews, but also just poking fun. And to exclaim, or even just record and save on a record, the name Jesus Christ is a taboo thing for a performer in the Yiddish language to do. And though this recording was made sometime in the 20s or so, as much as 50 years later, when this greater recording company release that I have on the right, with the image of Lebedev with his hands in his pockets, was released, he excised the name Jesus Christ from the recording. He just clipped it right out. So on my copy of the record, it just sounds like the record skips, but in fact, it is censorship by the label owner. And now, one of my greatest, if not my single greatest achievement in collecting was, at one point, 4 or 5 years ago, I saw a clip on YouTube of this ridiculous performance where these Hasidic Jews, or people dressed as Hasidic Jews, were dancing like mad to some oddball Yiddish song. And I wanted so badly to find out more about it. And it took some research, but I realized that it was a 1982 Yiddish film produced in the state of Israel. In fact, the first film in Yiddish produced in the state of Israel. And it's a disco musical. It's an absolute oddity of a film. And it took me over a year to find a copy to watch it. And I had shown the clip to my grandfather, and I just wanted to make sure that he got to see it, the whole film in his lifetime, and not just the clips I found online. And so through a year of constant effort, I managed to find a DVD of this movie, share it with my grandfather, and then watch it with some friends additionally. So here's that original clip I saw, the song Otazoi from the movie As Man geht, nimmt man.
Ken bereisen Winder über Winder, a Freu wuss keine Stuben und bei ihm a Titz mit Kinder, a Jid wuss keine Schlernen, ken bei ihm die ganze Teure, und a Jid ne ha Scheile, 11. Mois der Beure. Otazoi, Inser Rebe, Otschesmiche, Otazoi, ken vieren Rabenliche, Otazoi,
That's the way they're all kosher Hasidim. A very wonderful and strange piece of music that I put in an immense effort to get my hands on a copy of, and it gave me an incredible amount of satisfaction to find. So along the way in my collecting process and in publicizing my radio show, I've come across a bunch of unusual typos or mistakes in the liner notes of the records that I collect. And among them, on the left, I have some section of lyrics where a typo placed a profane word amid a very sincere and sweet Yiddish song. So I get a lot of pleasure from these types of things. I find it hysterical, and it becomes a nice in-joke that I'm able to share on my social media with my friends who are also fans of this music. So I've got the unintended and here censored profanity from a very sweet lullaby tune. And on the right, I have a song that on the track list, for some reason, there's a song called Rosetlu on this record. And now Rosetlu is not a Yiddish word. In fact, it's not a word in any language that I could find. And so I challenged my friends to identify what the title of the song actually should have been. And it turns out that Rosetlu, to a French speaker, is phonetically kind of similar to the Yiddish word chosidel. So this was a French record, and someone probably was told to type chosidel, and they were like, okay, it's typed Rossettlou. So things like that are just sort of little gems I encounter along the way in my collecting process. So starting in the year 2000, starting last year, I was able to distribute to an additional station called Radio Catskill, which I mentioned at the beginning. They are in the Catskill region of New York State, and that area was once the Jewish vacation land. It was where the Jews went to get out of their, primarily out of New York City. And they wanted me to change the name of the program from Laughing with Lizards to something that was a little more recognizable content-wise. So I asked around, and my friend, wonderful trumpet player Jordan Hirsch, suggested Borscht Beat. Then my friend Hannah Sheehan made the artwork for it, and the rest is history. I broadcast now on those three stations, WVKR, WJFF, and WCFA each week. And I've got a lot of listeners from a lot of different places. Then sometime mid last year, I had the idea that I would start a record label with the relationships that I've built up with artists. And I released this record, Vorspiel 2, which is pictured here, the psychedelic swirling colors. This record fuses traditional Yiddish folk songs, women's folk songs, with virtuosic musicianship that brings the songs into this unusual hard rock, psychedelic rock realm. It's a very, very unique type of music to listen to. And on the bottom left, I have this other project that is soon to be released, Maharaja Sweet Still Life, a different sort of music, a different expression of Jewish music, but fitting the bill all the same. And I'm going to play a clip from this Vorspiel album. It's quite a bit different than all the other music I've played, but is equally Yiddish, equally Jewish, and very interesting and moving to me. So that's Vorspiel 2, the album that I've had the great pleasure of releasing on CD and sharing with the world. So just a month or two into my return to radio, my grandfather Max passed away at the age of 105 years old. And of course, he was able to hear a little of the program, which is invaluable to me. And I was able to get him recording the introduction and outro to the show. And Fortunately, my father recorded a lot of interviews with him, so I have clips of him to play at the end of every episode of the program. And this whole project is not only inspired by him, but done for him. And it's my way of acknowledging my cultural heritage as imparted to me by my grandfather. So it's a very meaningful personal project to me, and one that I always have the encouragement, knowing that he was inspired by it and that this music meant a lot to him. On the right, I have a photograph of him, age 15 or so, with his father, Louis. On the right, him maybe 10 or so years later with my grandmother in the park, making a sort of devious face at the camera. And in the center is one of the last photographs I took of him, sometime in November 2020, maybe. I had been experimenting with different film photography, which was something that was a passion for him throughout his life, and unintentionally snapped this beautiful, ominous double exposure of him. And he would always say when we had a double exposure among his photos, he'd say, well, it's 2 for the price of 1. So one last thing that I'll share with you is a recording I made of my grandfather a couple years before he passed away, where he sings a Yiddish song that I'd never heard before. And I went on to share it with thousands of people. At this point, it's probably been viewed by at least 100,000 people. And no one has been able to quite identify what this song is. But it's a funny song, funny lyrics, and I'll share it for you right now.
Go.
Menschen sind Maschine, sie singen noch ein Fisch. Ich bin ein Zedreiter, sing ich bin ein Eise Knisch. Ein Knisch mit Potatoes und ein Teller Smetana. Leck ich meine Finger wie ein klein Kessel. Hey, bum, pitchem, patchem, wer ist mir? Soll auf Hitler wachsen ein Geschwür. The college boys alle, ze slingen goldfish. Na, ich will a sickness. You never heard that?
I don't know it. Okay.
Oh, at that time, if you remember, the college boys, they were swallowing live goldfish. No, they were swallowing live. So I tell them.
Go.
Mention.
Well, that's my presentation. I guess what I'll do is quickly explain to you what those lyrics were. They're funny. The lyrics are, people are going crazy. They're singing about fish. I too am going crazy. I'm singing about a hot knish. A knish made of potatoes with a plate of sour cream. And I'm licking my fingers like a little cat. La-di-da, oh gosh. Adolf Hitler should get a ulcer. The college boys, they're all swallowing goldfish. Me, I'll eat a knish. So that's my presentation. Thank you all for joining, and I can take any questions you have.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, does anyone have any questions they want to put in the chat? Or unmute yourself and ask?
Feel free. I know a lot about this stuff. I talk about it for an hour every single week on the radio, and then constantly with my friends and family otherwise.
Susan, unmute yourself.
Okay. The quick question is, first of all, everything was great. Thank you. And do you know anything about, I heard about Barry Manilow's musical about some group. Was that Yiddish or?
So that musical, I haven't seen it yet, but it is put on by the big Yiddish theater company, the New York Volksbühne, and the same group that put on the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof run a few years ago. So it's definitely related. I've yet to see it though, but I'm aware of the musical.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so someone in the chat asked how they can get in touch and when I presented another venue. to present at another venue. My email address is aaronbendage@gmail.com. I just put it in the chat. And for any of you who are interested in listening to my program, I've got a website where I have all the information for that. It airs twice on Sundays, 11 a.m., 1 p.m., and Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. What are the words to Eufen Pripyatchik in Yiddish? Off the top of my head, at the fireplace, burns a fire, and in the house it's warm, and the rabbi teaches little children the alphabet. And then listen, children, to what I say. And there's like a language lesson in it. That the point being that the letter Aleph with the comets under it, the sort of T shape, is pronounced O in Ashkenazi Hebrew and Yiddish. So and then later in the song it says something along the lines of often in the letters you will find, or like in the letters you'll find so many tears. But if you're interested in getting some more of these lyrics, I can provide any resources that you might need. Just shoot me an email at aaronbendage@gmail.com. I've got a lot of materials on this topic on my hands, including hundreds and hundreds of records, the notes associated with those records, dozens of books on the topic. It's a passion of mine. But yeah, so is my show on the internet? Yes, it is. I'll provide a link to, so at borschtbeat.com, you can access both my website to purchase Borscht Beat t-shirts and stuff like that, or you can click the other button and go to where I've got a partial archive of my show and details about how to stream them online. But yes, it plays simultaneously at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on Sundays, online and in person, and on your FM radio receivers, as well as on Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. And those are on 3 different radio stations. And then also, if you're interested in the music that I'm commercially releasing for other artists, I share that on these websites as well. I'm on social media, Facebook and Instagram, and TikTok, for all of you TikTok users out there, which has availed me a very interesting and different audience than I'd ever expected. Any more questions?